If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have told you my life was perfect. Scarlet and I had built something special, a life full of warmth, laughter, and the kind of love that made other couples jealous. But perfection, as I've come to learn, is fragile. Sometimes the cracks are so small you don't notice them at first. And then, one day, they're everywhere. It started with little things. Scarlet was distracted more often, her phone glued to her hand like a lifeline. She used to leave it lying around, but now it was always with her, even when she went to the bathroom. She started coming home later, blaming work or traffic. I told myself not to overthink it. She had always been ambitious, and long hours weren't unusual in her line of work. But there was something different this time, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One night, I sat at the kitchen table waiting for her. The clock read 8:17 p.m., and her dinner sat untouched on the stove. Scarlet finally walked in, her heels clicking against the floor. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sorry I'm late," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "We had a last-minute meeting. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, of course. Dinner's on the stove if you're hungry." She thanked me, but instead of sitting down, she poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. I watched her sip it slowly, staring out the window as if she were somewhere else entirely. "Scarlet," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" She blinked, as if I'd startled her. "What?" "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I wanted to say, "Because you're not here anymore." Not really. But instead I shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem distant." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just work stress, Mason. It's nothing to worry about." She walked past me and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me sitting there with a gnawing feeling in my gut. A week later, I met up with Logan. He's my best friend, the kind of guy you trust with your life. We've been through a lot together: college, careers, the ups and downs of adulthood. Logan's a former military psychologist, which means he's not just good at reading people, he's practically a mind reader. If anyone could help me figure out what was going on, it was him. We were at a little cafe downtown, sitting by the window with our coffees. Logan leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes fixed on me. "All right," he said, cutting through the small talk. "What's eating at you?" I sighed, staring down at my cup. "It's Scarlet," I admitted. "She's different lately. Distant. I don't know how else to describe it." Logan didn't say anything at first, just nodded for me to keep going. "She's always on her phone, she's working late more often, and—" I hesitated, hating how paranoid I sounded. "There's this guy at her office, Rich. She mentions him sometimes. Too much, maybe." Logan raised an eyebrow. "What does she say about him?" "Nothing bad," I said quickly. "Just little things, like how funny he is or how he's good at his job. But it's the way she says it, Logan. Like she lights up when she talks about him." Logan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Mason, let me ask you something. Do you trust her?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to say yes, but the words caught in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted. "I used to. But now, I don't know." Logan nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Look, Mason, I don't want to jump to conclusions here. Scarlet's always been a solid partner. But you're not imagining this change. Something's going on, whether it's work stress, something with her family, or, yeah, maybe even this rich guy." I felt my stomach twist. "So what do I do?" "You talk to her," Logan said simply. "Not in a confrontational way. Just be honest. Tell her how you're feeling, and listen to what she has to say." "Easier said than done," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Logan smirked. "Most things worth doing are." That night, I lay in bed next to Scarlet, staring at the ceiling. She was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I turned my head to look at her, taking in the curve of her cheek, the way her hair spilled across the pillow. She looked so peaceful, so beautiful. It made me wonder if I was the one who had changed, if maybe I was just overthinking everything. But then I remembered the way she smiled when she talked about Rich. The way her phone lit up with messages she didn't share. The way she was here, but not really here. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, and I was terrified of what I might find if I dug too deep. But I couldn't just let it fester either. Whatever was happening, I had to face it. Scarlet shifted in her sleep, her hand brushing against mine. I squeezed her fingers gently, though she didn't stir. We used to be so strong, I thought. When did that start to change? The cracks were there, spreading like spiderwebs across the surface of our life. And I had no idea how to fix them. If I could pinpoint the exact moment when things shifted, it was the day Scarlet first mentioned Rich. I didn't think much of it at the time. He was just a name, someone she worked with, someone who came up in casual conversation. But as the weeks went by, his name kept appearing, like a stray thread unraveling the fabric of our life. "He's hilarious," Scarlet said one evening over dinner. "The way he handled that client today, you should have seen it, Mason. He had the whole room eating out of his hand." I nodded, pushing my mashed potatoes around my plate. "Sounds like a character." "He is," she replied, smiling. But it wasn't just any smile, it was that kind of smile. The one that lingered too long, the one you'd wear when someone leaves an impression on you. I tried to let it go. Everyone has work friends, right? People they click with, people they share jokes with to get through the day. But there was something about the way she talked about him that made my chest tighten, like the air in the room had thinned. A few days later, I found myself in the garage, fiddling with an old toolbox that didn't need organizing. It was just an excuse to be alone, to think. That's when Logan showed up. He had a knack for dropping by unannounced, but I didn't mind. Lately, I needed someone to talk to. "Still working on that thing?" he asked, gesturing at the box. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his sharp blue eyes scanning me like I was one of his patients. "Not really," I said with a sigh. "Just keeping my hands busy." Logan didn't press me right away. He waited, like he always did, letting the silence work its magic. Eventually, I spoke. "It's Rich," I admitted, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "She keeps talking about him." Logan's expression didn't change, but I saw the gears turning in his head. "What does she say about him?" "Everything," I said. "How funny he is, how smart he is, how good he is at his job. She's like, enchanted by him." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Enchanted, huh? That's a strong word." I set the toolbox down and leaned against the workbench. "I know how it sounds. I don't want to be that guy, you know? The insecure husband who can't handle his wife having male friends. But it's more than that. I can feel it." Logan nodded slowly. "Instincts are there for a reason, Mason. Don't ignore them. But don't let them control you either. You've got to approach this carefully." I let out a bitter laugh. "Carefully? How am I supposed to do that when I feel like I'm losing her?" Logan stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, Mason. People like this Rich guy, sometimes they're harmless. Sometimes they're not. You need to find out who he is before you let this eat you alive." That night, I started paying closer attention. Not snooping, just observing. Scarlet's phone buzzed more often now, little flashes of light illuminating her face at odd hours. She always smiled when she read the messages, but she never mentioned who they were from. "Who's that?" I asked casually one evening, as she typed away on her screen. "Just work stuff," she said without looking up. "We've got a big project coming up." She said it so easily, like there was nothing unusual about it. But the way her thumbs moved over the keyboard, the quick glances she shot at me when she thought I wasn't looking, it didn't sit right with me. The next morning, as Scarlet left for work, I decided to take Logan's advice. I needed to know more about Rich. I wasn't proud of it, but I called Scarlet's office and asked for some basic information. Just enough to paint a picture. "He's a senior consultant," the receptionist told me. "Been with us about a year. Great guy, everyone loves him. That word again, loves. It made my stomach turn. By the time Scarlet came home that evening, I was a mess of nerves. I tried to act normal, to play the part of the husband who wasn't slowly unraveling. But when she mentioned Rich again, this time about how he'd stayed late to help her with a presentation, I couldn't hold back. You talk about him a lot, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Scarlet froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I said, leaning back in my chair, that it feels like I'm sharing you with someone else. Her eyes narrowed. That's ridiculous, Mason. He's just a coworker. Is he? I shot back. Because it seems like he's more than that to you. Scarlet's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she might yell. But instead she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to listen to this, she said, grabbing her plate and heading to the kitchen. I wanted to go after her, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, staring at the empty spot where she'd been, wondering how the hell we'd gotten here. Later that night, Logan called. He didn't say much, just enough to let me know he was there if I needed him. I didn't tell him what had happened, I couldn't. But as I lay in bed next to Scarlet, her back turned to me, I realized something important. This wasn't just about Rich. This was about us, about the cracks in our foundation that I hadn't seen until now. And if I didn't figure out how to fix them, I was going to lose her. When I woke up the next morning, Scarlet was already gone. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, and her empty mug sat in the sink, but she hadn't left a note or texted me. It wasn't like her to leave without saying goodbye, but these days, it was hard to tell what was like her anymore. I stared at the cold mug for a moment, then picked up my phone. Logan answered after the second ring. You sound like you haven't slept, he said, his tone already halfway to concerned. Didn't, I admitted. Scarlet and I argued last night. I think I pushed her too hard. Logan sighed. What happened? I recounted the conversation, my voice thick with regret. Logan listened without interrupting, the way he always did, but I could almost feel his disapproval through the line. Mason, he said finally, I get why you're upset, but confrontation isn't going to fix this. Scarlet needs space, not accusations. If she feels cornered, she'll pull away even more. She's already pulling away, I said bitterly. And this Rich guy, he's right there to catch her. That's exactly why you need to take a step back, Logan said, his voice firm. You're focusing on Rich when you should be focusing on her. You can't compete with him, Mason, not by playing his game. What do I do then? I asked. Just sit back and watch her slip away. No, Logan said. You figure out what's really going on. And you start by understanding who you're dealing with. By the time I hung up, I felt a sliver of hope. Logan had always been the calm in my storm, the voice of reason when I couldn't find my own. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. Later that day, Logan called me back. I did some digging, he said. About Rich. My stomach tightened. And? He's exactly what you'd expect, Logan said. Charming, charismatic, and according to a few mutual contacts, very good at getting what he wants. I frowned. What does that mean? It means he's a player, Mason. A textbook manipulator. He's not interested in relationships, he's interested in conquest. And once he's won, he moves on. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could picture Rich so clearly now, the too perfect smile, the effortless charm, the kind of man who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. Scarlet doesn't see it, I said quietly. She thinks he's just a friend. Of course she does, Logan said. Guys like him are good at what they do. They make you feel special, like you're the only person in the room. But it's all a game to them. I gripped the phone tighter. What do I do? First, you don't panic, Logan said. And second, you make her see the truth, not by telling her, but by helping her realize it herself. That evening, I decided to follow Logan's advice. Scarlet came home late again, her face flushed from the cold, and her coat dusted with snow. She didn't say much as she slipped off her boots and hung up her scarf, and I didn't press her. Instead, I made dinner and kept the conversation light. "How was work?" I asked as we ate. "Busy," she said, barely looking up. "The project's wrapping up soon, so everyone's running around trying to finish their part." I nodded, keeping my tone casual. "And Rich? Is he still as charming as ever?" Scarlet paused, her fork hovering over her plate. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," I said with a shrug. "You talk about him a lot." She frowned, setting her fork down. "I told you before, Mason. He's just a colleague." "I know," I said quickly. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I worry, that's all." "Worry about what?" she asked, her voice sharper than I expected. "About us," I said honestly. "About how distant we've been lately. I miss you, Scarlet." For a moment, her expression softened. She reached across the table and took my hand. "I miss us too," she said quietly. "But I need you to trust me, Mason. There's nothing going on." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the doubt was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next day, I met Logan for coffee. He listened as I told him about the conversation, nodding thoughtfully. "She's in denial," he said. "Not about what's happening, but about what it means. Scarlet doesn't see Rich for who he is because she doesn't want to. She's using him as a distraction, Mason, not as a replacement." "But what if that changes?" I asked. "What if he convinces her?" "He won't," Logan said firmly. "Not if we make sure she sees the truth." I raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Logan smirked, his blue eyes glinting. "Leave that part to me." That evening, Scarlet was quieter than usual. She sat on the couch with her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard, but her eyes were distant. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I didn't want to push. Instead, I sat beside her, resting my hand lightly on her knee. "I love you," I said softly. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "I love you too," she said, but the words felt like an afterthought. I held her gaze, searching for the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I knew was still in there somewhere. And for a brief moment I thought I saw her, the flicker of something real beneath the surface. But then she looked away, and the moment was gone. I didn't know what Logan's plan was, but I hoped it would work. Because I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was okay. If trust is the glue that holds a marriage together, doubt is the solvent. The more I tried to trust Scarlet, the more my mind replayed every odd glance, every quiet moment, every too perfect mention of Rich. It was a loop I couldn't escape, and every time I thought I'd found solid ground, something new would pull me under. Logan had a plan. He wouldn't tell me what it was, but I trusted him. He had a way of seeing through people, of peeling back their layers to reveal who they really were. And Rich? Rich was a man who thrived in shadows. I saw the first crack in Rich's perfect facade when Scarlet came home from work that Friday. She was unusually quiet, her brow furrowed as she put her things down and poured herself a glass of wine. Normally, she would launch into a story about her day, but this time, she just stared at the liquid swirling in her glass. "What's on your mind?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated, then said, "Rich was different today." I sat up straighter. "Different how?" "He was just off," she said, her voice distant. "He snapped at one of the interns during a meeting. I've never seen him lose his temper like that before." I didn't say anything, but inwardly, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was starting to see him for what he really was. The next day, Logan called me. His voice had that no-nonsense tone he used when he'd figured something out. "Mason, you're not going to like this," he said. "Great," I muttered. "Hit me." "I had a friend look into Rich's background," Logan said. "He's got a history of charming his way into women's lives, then leaving chaos in his wake. It's like clockwork, He isolates them from their support systems, makes them question everything, and then, once they've burned their bridges, he walks away. I clenched my fist around the phone. Does Scarlet know? No, Logan said. And she's not going to believe it if you just tell her. She has to see it for herself. Scarlet's behavior grew more erratic over the next week. She was distracted, lost in thought, and increasingly short-tempered. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off, saying she was just tired. One night, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in her hand and a troubled look on her face. What's wrong? I asked, sitting beside her. She hesitated, then said, Rich sent me a weird text. My pulse quickened. What kind of text? She handed me the phone, and I read the message. You deserve better. I don't know how you put up with someone who doesn't see you for who you are. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Scarlet shook her head. I don't know. He's been different lately. More intense. Scarlet, I said carefully, do you think he might be manipulating you? Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought she might laugh. But instead she said, Manipulating me? Mason, he's just a friend. Is he? I asked, my voice trembling. Because that doesn't sound like something a friend would say. Scarlet looked away, her jaw tightening. I don't want to talk about this right now. Logan and I met for coffee the next day. He was quiet as I told him about the text, his expression unreadable. She's starting to see it, he said finally. But she's not ready to admit it yet. So what do I do? I asked. How do I help her see it? Logan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. You don't push her. She's already questioning him, that's the first step. Let her come to her own conclusions, but be there to support her when she does. Easier said than done, I muttered. Logan smirked. Most things are. That evening, Scarlet came home late again. Her hair was disheveled, and there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. What happened? I asked as she sat down on the couch. She let out a heavy sigh. Rich. He's been strange. He started asking me personal questions, things about our marriage, about you. It's making me uncomfortable. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, And what do you say to him? I tried to change the subject, she said. But he doesn't let up. He keeps saying things like, you deserve to be happy, or you deserve someone who understands you. She paused, then added, It's like he's trying to plant ideas in my head. My heart ached at the confusion in her voice, but I also felt a spark of hope. Logan was right, she was starting to see through him. That night, Logan called me again. It's time, he said. We need to make sure she sees the full picture. How? I asked. Leave that to me, Logan said. Just be ready. The next day, Scarlet came home visibly shaken. She didn't say much during dinner, and when I asked her what was wrong, she simply said, I'm tired. But later, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and said, Mason, do you think people can change? I looked at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? Rich, she said quietly. I thought he was my friend, but now, I don't know what he is. I reached out and took her hand. Scarlet, people can change, but only if they want to. And some people don't change at all. They just keep pretending to be something they're not. She didn't respond, but I felt her fingers tighten around mine. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By the time I woke up the next morning, Scarlet had already left for work. Her absence felt heavier than usual, like a piece of the house had been taken away. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee she had brewed before leaving, and wondered how long I could keep pretending things were normal. That afternoon, Logan called. It's happening tonight, he said, his voice steady. I've got everything set up. What does that mean? I asked, my pulse quickening. It means she's going to see who Rich really is, Logan replied. But you need to be ready for her reaction. It might not be what you expect. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Scarlet had been drifting away for so long that I barely recognized her anymore. If Logan's plan worked, would it bring her back, or push her further away? That evening, Scarlet came home looking unusually pale. She set her bag down and walked straight to the couch without a word. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced at it with a mixture of anxiety and frustration before silencing it. "Everything okay?" I asked cautiously. She nodded, but it was the kind of nod that said no, not at all. I sat down next to her, careful not to crowd her space. "It's Rich," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened. "What about him?" Scarlet stared at her hands, twisting her fingers together. "He said some things today. Personal things. About us." "What kind of things?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. She hesitated, then said, "He told me I deserve better. That you don't understand me, that I'd be happier if I left." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Mason, he doesn't even know you. What gives him the right to say that?" Anger flared in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What did you say to him?" "I told him to stop," she said. "But he wouldn't let it go. He started talking about how he could make me happy, how I shouldn't waste my life." She paused, shaking her head. It was like he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I didn't know exactly what Logan had done, but it was working. The scales were starting to fall from Scarlet's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. "Scarlet," I said gently, "you need to understand something. Guys like Rich, they know exactly what to say to make you doubt yourself, to make you doubt everything. It's not about you, it's about him. He needs to feel like he's in control, like he's the one calling the shots." She looked at me, her brow furrowed. "You sound like Logan." I smiled faintly. "Logan knows people. He's seen this kind of thing before." Scarlet nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. "It's just, I feel so stupid. How did I not see it?" "Because he didn't want you to," I said. "That's the whole point. He's good at hiding his true intentions." Scarlet leaned back against the couch, her eyes distant. "I thought he was my friend. I thought he cared about me." "He doesn't care about you, Scarlet," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "He cares about control. And when he can't get it, he moves on to the next person." Later that night, Logan called to check in. "How did she take it?" he asked. "She's starting to see the truth," I said. "But it's hard for her." "It will be," Logan said. "People like Rich don't just manipulate, they make you doubt yourself. Scarlet's going to need time to process everything." "Thanks for everything, Logan," I said sincerely. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't thank me yet," Logan replied. "There's still work to do." The next day, Scarlet confronted Rich at the office. I didn't know all the details, but when she came home that evening, she looked like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I told him I didn't want to see him anymore," she said, setting her bag down. "I told him to leave me alone." "And how did he take it?" I asked. Scarlet hesitated, then said, "He got angry. He said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret it. But I didn't back down." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you," I said. She looked at me, her eyes glistening. "Mason, I'm so sorry. For everything. For how distant I've been. I never meant to hurt you." "I know," I said softly. "But we need to work through this together. We can't let someone like Rich come between us." Scarlet nodded, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least we were facing it together. The morning after Scarlet told me about her confrontation with Rich, I woke up feeling lighter. For the first time in months, it seemed like the distance between us was closing. But I knew this wasn't the end of the battle, it was just the beginning. Scarlet sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her face was bare, vulnerable. She looked up as I entered, her eyes soft but weary. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup and sitting across from her. "How are you feeling?" She let out a small sigh, staring into her mug. "Relieved. Angry. Embarrassed. It's a mix." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to be embarrassed, Scarlet. People like Rich are good at what they do. It's not your fault." She met my eyes, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have." "No," I interrupted gently. "Don't do that to yourself. You saw it when it mattered." She squeezed my hand, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you, Mason. For being patient. For still being here." That afternoon, Logan called to check in. "How's Scarlet doing?" he asked. "She's processing," I said. "She confronted him yesterday, told him to leave her alone." "Good," Logan said. "That's a big step. But be prepared, guys like Rich don't usually go quietly." The thought sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" "I mean he might try to manipulate her again," Logan said. "Or he might lash out in some way. Either way, you need to stay close and keep her grounded." "Got it," I said, though the knot in my stomach tightened. "Thanks, Logan." "Any time," he said. "And Mason? You're doing the right thing. Just keep being there for her." Later that evening, Scarlet and I sat together on the couch. It felt good to have her close again, to feel her warmth beside me. She rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" She hesitated, then said, "Rich wasn't just trying to get me to leave. He wanted me to hurt you. He said things, horrible things. About how you didn't deserve me, about how you were holding me back." I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling in my chest. "He had no right to say that." "I know," she said. But for a moment, I believed him. I let his words get into my head, Mason. And I hate myself for it. I turned to her, cupping her face in my hands. "Scarlet, listen to me. You're human. You were vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. But you didn't let him win. You saw through him, and that's what matters." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded. "I just want us to be okay again. I want to fix this." "We will," I promised. "But we have to do it together." The next day, Scarlet came home early from work. She looked calmer, more centered, but there was a new determination in her eyes. "I talked to HR," she said, setting her bag down. "I told them about Rich, about how he's been crossing lines, manipulating people. I don't know if they'll do anything, but at least they know." I felt a swell of pride. "That was brave of you." "It felt good," she admitted. "Like taking back control." We spent the rest of the evening talking, not just about Rich, but about us. About the things we'd let slip over the years, the little cracks we'd ignored. It was painful, but it was necessary. For the first time in a long time, we were honest with each other. A week later, Scarlet received an email from HR. Rich had been removed from the project and reassigned to a different location. It wasn't the complete justice we'd hoped for, but it was enough to ensure he wouldn't have the same access to her. "He's out of my life," she said, exhaling deeply as she read the email. "It's finally over. It's not just about him," I said, pulling her into a hug. "It's about us. And I don't want to lose what we have, Scarlet. I'm willing to fight for it, no matter what." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening. "I am too. I promise." That night, as we lay in bed, I held her close, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The storm had passed, but the work wasn't over. Relationships, I realized, aren't about avoiding cracks. They're about learning how to repair them together. Scarlet whispered into the darkness, her voice steady and full of hope. "I love you, Mason." "I love you too," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. For the first time in a long time, I believed we were going to be okay.